Welcome to Chax Poetry Talks, a podcast brought to you by Chax Press. This is Charles Alexander. I'm your host and speaker. You can find Chax Press online at chax.org. And now, the podcast. Hi, today's podcast may be for all of you who like to play pirates when you were children, not because you liked swords and their scabbards or strange hats or skull and crossbones or eye patches, rather because you like to say arg. That is, this is a podcast, at least in part, about pronunciation of poetry. Many definitions of poetry have to do with pleasure. And I think one of the pleasures often missed when people are talking about this is the pleasure of pronunciation, a physical pleasure. In the beginnings of English poetry, that pleasure is apparent, especially for us looking backward when we're looking at a language we, for the most part, do not know anymore. And in some sense, this pleasure is a kind of erotic pleasure. It's not about understanding, and that's crucial. The contemporary poet Lynn Heginian's useful phrase, "we who love to be astonished," may guide us here. To truly love poetry, you have to love to be astonished, and that rapture, very nearly the same thing that Wordsworth felt when he declared that to him nature was all in all as he entered the sublime, is a far different thing than understanding, in the common sense of "I get it," which usually means I can toss it aside, never having to return to it, in an experience more related to market consumerism than to the pleasure poetry offers. But back to Old English. In this line, English itself is a foreign language to most of us. What we gardena? What we gardena? What we gardena? I'm saying it 3 times here in hopes it may linger. It's the first half of the first line of Beowulf, from about 680 to 800 AD. However, the timeline of Beowulf has been in dispute, and it may be as much as a couple hundred years after that. You don't have to know what the Old English means, although it helps to know it is a kind of boastful greeting, said with gusto, that the ah of what should be pronounced like the short a of drat or nat or that, and the hw of what, the beginning, hwa, should literally be sounded like a wind blowing until it closes in that W sound, hwa. That the word we is pronounced more like the contemporary way than like we as in us. That the R in gardena should be slightly rolled, and the first syllable of gardena should be a noticeably longer syllable than any other in that word. The de in gardena should be spoken like day, the day in which we are experiencing ourselves right now, but cut off just a bit short. And the final na should sound like the final na in banana. Now say it all, slowly. What we gardena. Okay, then again and again, each time a bit faster, but with more confidence than with speed. What we gardena. Until you say it as if you are greeting a friend who has come into the very friendly pub in which you like to down a pint now and then and have a very good time. Feel what your lips do at the beginning to both produce and cut off that wind. How the tongue slaps inside the mouth on that first t. how you go to the back of the mouth at the beginning of Arena, but then come up toward the front to roll that R, and then just stop, neither too suddenly nor with too much lingering, as you let out that short exhalation of na. If it doesn't feel good to say, you're either not doing it right, or you haven't considered that speech is a physical pleasure related to kissing, breathing in cool air, cooing, whistling, oral sex, licking a popsicle, and other great things you can do with your mouth. To go back to my beginning, from fairies articulating the material world, as can happen in Shakespeare, to dreaming the world into being, as can happen in A Midsummer Night's Dream, to actually pronouncing the words in the poem. Dream, pronunciation, pleasure, poem. The Anglo-Saxon period is full of some great poetry, both the long work Beowulf, which is in some ways our beginning epping in English, a story of a great hero who becomes a great hero by saving a community from a monster, goes back into battle to when provoked by that monster's mother. There have been movies about this. There have been many translations of it. And I haven't yet come upon a truly bad translation. However, nothing awakened me to feeling this poem until I studied Old English and read it in the original. And that just gave more of a sense of not really the grandeur, but the grittiness of this world. I love the way in which Old English has much of alliteration. You know, the Speardanes, Shilling, the names. There's so much that wants to linger on the tongue. I want to turn away from Beowulf, perhaps, to the Seafarer. And I ask your forgiveness a little bit because my studies in the language of Old English are a few decades ago. And while I have continued to return to it, I haven't had anybody test my pronunciation for a very long time. The Seafarer is a poem about one who is isolated. It's one of the saddest poems we have in our language, and yet it is one of the richest too. I'm going to read a little bit of it in Old English, and then I'm going to read a little bit of it in a 20th century translation. So here, the Seafarer. Mag ich me silfum, solgid recken, sitha sekan, hu ik geschwinderagam, erfothwela, oft troada, bitre breostkera, gebidden heba, gekunned in keola, ker selda fela, ato etha yawelk. Notice those sounds, sithas sekan. Bitre breostkera. There's often a repetition of that syllable sound in each half of the line. And also in every line, there's a pause. Sithas sejan hu ik geschwinktagum. So that there is what we call a caesura, or pause. And that is part of the rhythmical wonder of not only this poem, but poetry in Old English in general. Here is a translation of what I just read. May I, for my own self-song's truth reckon, journey's jargon, how I in harsh days hardship endured oft. Bitter breast cares have I abided, Known on my keel many a care's hold and dire sea surge. Okay, that is the way that goes in the translation of The Seafarer by Ezra Pound, who in some ways brought the Old English back into circulation in contemporary poetry circa the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Pound, who was looking for old models of poetry that had been somewhat neglected. So we have in English a rich heritage here. If you ever want to test your tongue, throat, and mouth skills in pronunciation, go straight to the Old English. Don't worry about whether you know it yet. There are plenty of sources of translations that can help you with that. But I love it that we can expand what we think of as beautiful in the language. And we have in English our slides and glides and lilting lyrics, our when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed. But we also have our gooey, chewy, crunchy language. You know, one place you can find it is All is Changed Utterly of W.B. Yeats, where, in a sense, the clashing of sounds there, the rather difficult to pronounce changed, almost brings what he's feeling of something of the early 20th century and its changes, its crash of old systems into not only our senses, but our ears. Poetry can be thought of as ear music. And today I've tried to bring you a little bit of some of the origins of that in the oldest poetry in English that we have. Thank you.